So I don't care about the grades, but I do care that you read, and I do care that you complete your projects and ask questions and, do stuff. But it is that. So what you're saying, I love the idea of unlearning and that it happened for you and that they didn't give it to you. And then it's really hard as a parent to sit back and go, oh, let's just hope it's going to happen soon.
School is in. But are you really ready to learn? Open your eyes to a new day in education with the Awakening Educator, a program specifically designed to explore a new, mindful way of educating our youth. Learn about social-emotional learning, new modalities of teaching, and the most relevant topics in education with your hosts, Susan Andrian and Megan Sweet. Susan and Megan will take you inside the issues by looking at them from different points of view, from policies and research to teaching models that are actually used in schools. There's never a dull moment in this classroom. Have any questions you'd like to ask? Maybe you have knowledge you'd like to share. And share your thoughts live on air. Grab a pen and paper and get ready to open your textbooks and minds to a new way of learning on the Awakening Educator.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Awakening Educator. I'm Megan Sweet.
And I'm Susan Andrian.
And we're really fortunate today to have Zoie Hoffman on the show. And she's going to be talking about ways to support students outside of a traditional classroom. So welcome, Zoie.
Thanks for having me. It's so great to be here with you.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background?
Sure. So basically, I set out to be an educator when I was getting my bachelor's degree. So I got a bachelor's degree in elementary education at Texas A&M University, really great education school. And I wanted to be a classroom teacher. I wanted to help kids get education that they needed. I was a struggling student all throughout school until I kind of finally figured out how to teach myself on my own. And then I became a ravenous learner. And so, but plans hardly ever work out how you want them to. Mm-hmm. So I married someone who was going to be active duty in the Air Force, and therefore we were going to move around a lot. So we got to that first duty station that they told us we needed to be at, and I realized very quickly that classroom education was not going to work out for our lifestyle. A lot of people do it, but there's a lot of moving, a lot of transferring certificates and things like that. So for that first duty station, I said, well, I'm just going to tutor kids in the local area just to keep my skills sharp. And kind of from there, I started to realize I really enjoyed that one-on-one interaction and helping the parents as well. And I realized there was a real need for that, for kids to get kind of an individualized instruction outside of the classroom. Later on, as we started to move again, I taught myself how to do online tutoring. This was way before COVID and way before online learning was, a bigger deal. A lot of people said, how would you even do that? That doesn't make any sense. And I started to bring on online tutors that were really awesome educators with teaching backgrounds and teaching certificates to match those teachers up with students to do online learning. And then obviously, as the times have changed, our platform that we use is more relevant as people realize that, you can't always go to an in-person meeting.
That's really interesting. And you're right. Life never offers you what you expect it to be. So go ahead and make some plans and see what happens. But what I appreciate about your story is, I guess most listeners are educators, but I will point out the primary challenge or the truth in education is that actually, I'm sorry, now my dogs are making noise because that's what they like to do. I was telling Zoie before we got on live that my dogs were being crazy and one of them's still tripping. So I apologize if y'all can hear that. But I was saying that
it's what happens when you're having a podcast.
Right, always they know and they like to make noise. I'm gonna start giving them credits on the show, Susan. Actually,
yeah, I think that's a great idea. Sparky, Shirley,
they need to be on here. Anyway, teacher credentialing is different state by state. So, so that is one of those places where and I think it's actually really ridiculous that that's true, but that's what's true. So you get credentialed in California, it doesn't necessarily mean that it works in Texas. So I would imagine that makes a lot of sense that if you're traveling a lot with a partner, being an educator is a challenging role to have. And if you have to leave mid-year, that would also be really challenging. So I think it's really smart, Zoie, that you came up with a new way of teaching. And you're not the only trained educator I know that has actually found that they love this more personalized one-on-one instruction that comes with tutoring as well. So that's really cool.
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of teachers who also do tutoring in addition to being a full-time teacher, teachers who are really veteran teachers, because, you know, it helps supplement their income, and they also love the joy of meeting one-on-one. And I'm curious, how do your tutors really work with the educational institution that their students are enrolled in, and is there any communication between the tutors and the schools, or just the tutor and the family? And how do you partner with the families and schools of the children that you're working with?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it really kind of varies on the kid and the family. So some families are so gung ho to get the tutor and me set up with, you know, the teacher's contact information, and any stakeholders' contact information, and we all kind of work together as a team. A lot of that happens over email. With that, though, is the difficulty of FERPA. And, you know, so really, we have a release that parents can sign, you know, releasing the teacher to talk with us. But if the teacher is very leery of, you know, kind of crossing that line and breaking those rules, that can be difficult. And so then what we have is kind of the teacher communicating to the parent and the parent communicating to us, a little bit of game of telephone, but that's better than nothing. And we're in constant communication with parents. The tutor and the parent usually will text or email, you know, weekly with assignments and like, this is what happened, here's what they need help on. As kids get a little bit older, because we currently tutor up to 8th grade, sometimes we'll take them a little bit further than that. If they have like a great relationship going with their tutor and the tutor feels comfortable with that material, the student starts to take responsibility for that communication a little bit more. And so maybe the check-ins with the parent are less frequent because the parent is wanting that student, and sometimes the tutor too is wanting that student to kind of take responsibility for communicating all of that stuff.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's interesting, and FERPA basically means that you have to keep things private. There's privacy regulations between. We have to keep kids private. So I just want to make sure everyone understood what that was. You said something when you introduced yourself that really caught my attention, which is, you know, you did all this pre-pandemic, and suddenly, and I'm imagining then the group of people that you worked with originally were parents that were seeking help for their kids because their kids had an identified need, or the parents were particularly concerned about their child's development and wanted to make sure that they had some extra support. And then the pandemic happened, and suddenly you're positioned to provide support in a really different way. And I don't know if business like improved for you as you went through the pandemic, or if the way you've interacted with folks since the pandemic has shifted. So have there been any impacts on you and the way you do your work, or the kinds of clients you've been getting in since the pandemic happened?
I would say there hasn't been too much of a shift. We're still seeing kids come in that need help in certain areas because the teacher has indicated or their parent is particularly concerned, like you said. But I have noticed that kids who were already behind are falling further behind. So now when I get on, because I always get on a phone call with parents before we do anything else within the practice, just to make sure that that's something, a relationship that would be beneficial to them. And so when they're telling me their story, a lot of it now is saying, well, they weren't doing great before COVID. Now they're doing really bad. because, maybe that online platform didn't work for them. They needed some more of that individualized attention. Maybe there were other aspects going on, like, there wasn't always an adult there to help them. So we're getting a lot of those kids in now as we're headed back into the classroom where it's becoming more apparent. And then also parents just telling me that they don't know how to help their child, because a lot of that is falling back onto the parents, to explain that math concept. And they didn't learn math like that. And so they kind of are fighting with their kids, and they're needing someone from the outside to come in and just kind of be a neutral party and teach that material, instead of, trying to teach it to their kids themselves and getting super frustrated. I've also seen just like a need for more information from parents. I've changed what we're doing on social media to just try to help parents get that education information that they need, because they're, expected to be educators now. Almost.
I'm curious about how much coaching you do of the parents that are who are having these power struggles or battles or showing up with frustration, about how you might be working with those parents to manage their own stress and their own internal state. My background is as a marriage and family therapist, and I'm trained in this neurodevelopmental model. And a lot of what we talk about is the caregiver affect management, like the adult managing their own internal stress and state. And curious, how do your tutors and how do you work with your families to maybe address some of those things with the parents, or maybe just encourage them, maybe you shouldn't be the one to be engaging them with math if what you're saying is, in my day, math looked so different.
Yeah. So this is actually something I've been thinking a lot about lately, and I'm glad you brought it up, because in general, we kind of just address things as they come up. I trust all of our tutors to teach and interact in whatever way they feel appropriate. So we're not using any curriculums or anything like that, because they're educators. I'm not going to micromanage them. They're getting enough of that in the classroom. And if they're in the classroom, if they're not in the classroom, they probably left partly because of that. Right. And so we're really, kind of just addressing those things on an individual basis. With a lot of the parents that I interact with, I do try to give them little hints on, how to maybe step back a little bit, or how to address their own anxieties around, like, especially math. Math is my thing that I tutor and I focus on. And I've been thinking a lot about how really a holistic approach could be the most beneficial for families that are really struggling and really fighting with each other, and parents that are really stressed about their kids' education. And I would really love to, at some point, bring on a parenting coach and an education advocate as, like, kind of team members on our staff to kind of help with that aspect of it, because I feel like it's a whole pie. Like, if you don't take care of that part, you can take care of the kids' academics to some extent, but there's always going to be that tension there.
I think often as parents, and we all have to manage our own expectations. I mean, I had to manage a lot this year with my child and what he did and didn't do in school, and how he was and wasn't in the classroom. But so much of the strain that can happen for a kid is between the parent and their expectations for their child, and not necessarily understanding how their child learns or what they need. And I was actually the same kind of student as you, Zoe. I graduated from high school not having a clue how to learn. I didn't know anything. I didn't know how to teach myself, and I didn't know how to learn. I guess I taught myself my freshman year in college. And like you, I just became voracious after that. As soon as I unlocked that set of skills that I needed to be able to learn, then suddenly everything was fine. But I didn't feel that way before. And you couldn't tell me any differently, because I knew what it felt like to be in the classroom. And, some clear things changed when I went to college. One of them was I wasn't in such a hectic environment anymore, even though there were a lot of people around. We were all quiet, and we were all, for the most part, following rules and all of that kind of stuff. but also I learned that I need to write everything down. So actually the lectures in college helped me because I wrote just a lot. And as soon as I wrote a lot, then I learned. Yeah. So go ahead, Susan.
I had a similar experience. I was much later even than you guys were. Freshman year did not happen for me. It was, after quitting and traveling. But the interesting thing is to watch my kids doing the same thing now as high school students. And I can see how bright and smart and amazing they are. But I think they're not they're not I think they could be if they wanted to, but it's not where their head is at. And you can't tell them different. And it's this interesting dynamic. Is it the school? Is it how we're approaching it? Is what's happening that so many of us who I think love learning and love engaging in learning get that light squished out. And I think that's really the point, or maybe it doesn't ever get ignited. Like, to Megan's point, you don't know how much you love learning until you get to experience that like efficacy around it.
Well, I think it's really, it's interesting to me. I mean, because you mentioned grades and like they could be an A student if they wanted to be. And I don't know about you guys, but I hear that from parents a lot about grades. And I'm constantly encouraging people to just stop looking at the grades because it's, I'm like, really figure out what you value here. Why do you value education? It cannot be because of the grades. No. And so you should be focused on what you value and not just those scores that you're seeing. It's so much easier said than done.
Yeah, I did that very easily in elementary school for my kids. Like it wasn't an issue at all. I knew they were reading. I knew they were learning. I knew they were getting things. But now they're in high school, and it's really a whole new ball game because your grade, you need to get grades to graduate or whatever the next phase is. And so I think it's this and I think that's where my challenge was as a parent. I wonder now, was that a mistake not to have at least some emphasis on completing things on it's a balance, right? I think it's what you value it, and I do value learning much more over grades. I do value having interesting, intellectual, exciting, thought-provoking conversations with my kids. And as Megan will say, they have those all the time, sometimes a little more than I'm ready to hear at times.
Well, I mean, I think you make an interesting point, Susan, and I wonder, Zoie, I also love what you said around like do the best you can to put the grades away, and where my mind went when you said that was my son was born a preemie, and so all of those milestones that he was supposed to hit were all blown out of the water because preemies don't develop like that, and so. It gave him an expectation-free first couple of years of life because I just didn't I just had to be like, okay, we're going to just see what happens here. And I could ride it also all the way through elementary school. But as you said, Susan, he's in middle school now, and I'm doing my best to just hang on while he figures himself out. And he doesn't have the love for learning that I have now. I trust that he'll come to it. And I think he needs to come to it when he finds a passion, but there's the real pressure on you need to become an adult and you need to be able to have what's next. Right. So, having grades and things like that, it's also a real thing because then you don't get into college. So how do you navigate? So, cause I love your point of view around it. And then I'm sure you're constantly confronted with pressure from parents like we are right now, but wait, they have to do something next. So how do you manage that with parents and how do you help them to realign themselves to their kids?
That's a good question. And I will just preface this with my children are very young, so I have not gotten to this point yet. And so my perspective is purely from the outside. And I know the pressure is real. I come from and I don't know what happened for you guys because you both kind of came from the same situation of, it just wasn't clicking. And then you got to college and then it finally clicked. And my grades weren't great. In middle school, half of high school, I finally pulled it out at the end because I realized that I had some goals that I wanted to achieve. My parents never said anything about it. They had no input. It was just do the best you can, decide what you want to do with your life and do it. And And that was actually really freeing because when I decided to do it, it was my decision. And I had that internal motivation to make it happen. I know that that is kind of an abnormal situation, especially for today's world. When, you know, if your child wants to go to college, then you know they have to get the grades to get there. Um,
Yeah, well, it's the unschooling model, which I think there's a lot of evidence that unschooling works, but it takes a long time to get there, and you have to start early. And so, being in the traditional system where it's not very interesting, and some of the classrooms aren't that great, but even it is a real dilemma. And I wonder, and this is where I wonder about myself as parenting and going back to elementary school. To the kids, I wonder about where is the line of pushing and holding accountable versus like engaging around your interest and not putting too much emphasis in the wrong place, but building up those habits of success. So like really, I tried to focus on that for a little while with them. And I think that that's really the more important aspect, is to what are the habits of
mhm.
a learner. Right. So I don't care about the grades, but I do care that you read, and I do care that you complete your projects and ask questions and, do stuff. But it is that. So what you're saying, I love the idea of unlearning and that it happened for you and that they didn't give it to you. And then it's really hard as a parent to sit back and go, oh, let's just hope it's going to happen soon.
Yeah. I
Right.
mean, my parents had no clue either, actually, Zoe. They were like, well, you either you're successful or you're not. So you either get an A grade or you get an F, and you'll have that experience and learn what that's like for you. Like that. I mean, there was hippie Berkeley parents. So like that was what was happening when I was growing up. But I think it did happen to work out as well. And so I do think there is this tension between something you said, Susan, which I imagine you do with your students, Zoe, is helping kids to have those skills of being a learner that actually transcend whatever the specific content area that maybe the parents are wanting to have their battle with the kids on. Like you're going to get an A in calculus or whatever it is. But moving towards like, what are the habits of a successful learner, or someone who's going to be able to take those skills and make them be successful in, outside of high school. When that ends, then there's a lot of other things that happen next. And how can we take some of those skills and translate them? Do you support the students with those kinds of things, Zoe?
Yeah. So, me personally, and I know a lot of our tutors do the same thing, like with my students for a long time, what I've done is we always do goal setting. So, kind of giving that a little bit of control back to the kid. Because a lot of kids that come into tutoring feel like they've lost all control. I
Right.
mean, most kids feel like they've lost all control at some point because, everybody's telling them what to do, everybody's getting on to them. They're just trying to like make it. So goal setting is always one of those cornerstones of our sessions where, they're setting a goal for what they want to accomplish in that subject, and then being held accountable for it. So learning that, how to be a good goal setter, how to reflect, how to look forward, how to be a good problem solver. That's kind of more of a math one. All of those go into a really great tutoring session. And if you have a really great tutor, they're going to be doing those things with your kids. And sometimes it's easier for someone on the outside to be the one who's talking to them about those skills, because when you're talking to them about those skills, you're also talking to them about cleaning their room. And so they're not going to listen as intently as they would to somebody else.
Yeah, you've sold me on the tutoring, Zoe. I'm so glad we talked today because, yeah, I mean, it's very topical, I think, for Susan and I both, because it's something we've talked about offline around what's that balance. But what I'm hearing from you is that not only can tutoring help kids like independently, but also is another way for parents to be able to provide support and have a different set of eyes and ears and in contact with kids that enables them to maybe hear those same lessons that you can't hear from parents anymore because it's just enough already. If I talk to my kid about certain things, he's over it. So that makes a ton of sense. This was such a pleasure to talk with you today. I can't believe our time has already gone so quickly, but how can people connect with you and learn more about the tutoring that you provide? Because I know you have a whole series of things. So please tell everybody how to connect with you and find you and all those different places.
Yeah, so if you want to learn about what we do and how online tutoring works, hoffmantutoringgroup.com is our website. And there's a contact form on there so you can contact me directly. And then also you can find us on social media. We're at hoffman.tutoring.group on Instagram and Hoffman Tutoring on Facebook.
Awesome. Thank you so
Awesome.
much. Zoie,
Thank you
for
so
joining
much,
us.
Zoe. It was
Thank
a pleasure.
you. It was lovely meeting you both.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everybody. Hey, listeners, are you enjoying this show? And do you want to hear more? Then please subscribe to our show on your favorite streaming platform. Like this show and tell others about us. We're available on Castbox, Deezer, Podcast Addict, Podchaser, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Spreaker, and Apple Podcasts. So please connect with us there. You also can watch shows live being recorded on our Facebook site, The Awakening Educator. You can connect with us via Instagram or Twitter at The Awakening Educator. And you can also subscribe to our newsletter. We've been busy recording a ton of terrific shows that will be rolling out over the rest of this year. So we would love to be able to have you be a regular member of our community. Thank you so much and have a great, great day.
Welcome to the second half of our show where we had a really interesting conversation with Dana Goodyear of Out of the Trenches podcast. We think you'll really enjoy it.
Yeah, my podcast is called Out of the Trenches, and it's been out for about a year. And I have interviewed you guys. That episode will be out in about a month or so. And I interview educators to tell stories of resiliency and, just times that they were in the trenches and managed to crawl out. I taught mostly English and world languages. I've been in school administration and I have a doctorate in educational leadership. And I'm excited to be on the show today.
Super excited to have you here, Dana. And I think, I'd love to hear more about what inspired you to come up with that show in particular, like why that theme around education out of the trenches.
Well, it's something I hear constantly when people talk about their work in education, that they are in the trenches. We're dealing with kids, we're dealing with state mandates or whatever it may be, and that they're doing that deep work in the trenches. Now, there are a lot of people who can interpret that in many different ways. I've talked to a couple of superintendents in the fall who were saying, yes, I'm currently in the trenches because I was, deciding how to do the COVID protocols and all that. There are a lot of people who interpret the story of in the trenches when they were first year teachers, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it's up to the guest what they would say in the trenches is. But my theme is, people have come out of that trench, right? We're all living some type of experience and we learn from them. So those stories of learning from that experience and growing, because we're lifelong we're lifelong learners as educators, I think help the listeners find out more about, people who have written books and people who, are these edu celebrities. They've all been in the trenches. So I think that helps.
It's really interesting. I think that it can evoke a lot of emotions when you hear about in the trenches, right? We think about it as this like space of the fight of the and the fight for what's really important. And when we think about resiliency and love, those things take work and often is a roller coaster of emotions of joy and grief and love of education. I don't know a single educator who digs down and stays in the trenches enough to be able to emerge from that with the joy of it, unless you're passionate about it. So I'm curious, what are been the themes of resiliency or the themes of love and passion and joy that come in each of the stories that you're hearing on your show?
Well, it's definitely that desire to work with kids and help them grow and learn and develop relationships with kids. I've talked, I'll give an example of a teacher who used to be a EMT, and then he went into teaching and the CTE program. So, he learned, how to teach the field where he had been working himself he was teaching high schoolers and now he's teaching middle schoolers. What got him into teaching was just that passion for, evoking his knowledge upon kids and helping kids learn more about science, the passion for science. And I think that comes out a lot in the guests, is how are they connecting with kids through the passion that they have, right? I had a passion for foreign language and traveling. And so when I taught foreign language, that really came out is my just passion for learning about each of these educators on the show has helped me, grow as an educator. Has kind of been my own professional development because everybody has their own story. And I've interviewed people across the board from newer teachers up through superintendents and people who are consultants and, authors and, people who've left the classroom and now support educators. So, I think it's been a real fun time for me. I've recorded over 100 episodes by now, so
Wow.
yeah, it's been really and I would say enriching to just connect with these educators and know that everybody has their own resiliency story.
100 episodes, Dana, dang.
I know.
We're at year 3 and we're at like 40. So
Yeah.
super impressed because putting on a podcast is a lot of work and it ends up being kind of a passion project in a lot of ways, right? Just the effort that goes into it.
Yeah.
What I was thinking about when you were talking about collecting these stories was actually what it was like for me as a first and second year teacher. Ironically, I ran into someone today via Zoom who was at my first school that I was at, which I think was pretty interesting. So apropos. But when I got to that kind of general public school, I encountered a lot of teachers that were burnt out. So you share the trench stories, which I think is helpful. And I don't know if it's like a different group of people or it's just kind of wherever phase you're in. But I remember coming in as a young, enthusiastic, overly idealistic, thinking I know everything kind of 23-year-old, which is who we are when we're that age generally. And I had all these ideas about how, and I was immediately put on all the leadership teams and all that stuff, because that's what you do with the new young person who doesn't know better than to say no, is you stick them on all the stuff, right? Someone who's mouthy, put them in the leadership team meetings and give them something to do. But what I encountered when I was there was a lot of educators that were tired and they didn't want to do it. And so I'd have these ideas and I kept showing up like, oh, well, what about this? We thought about that. And finally a woman kind of pulled me aside, and she knew me from when I was a child. So somebody who I felt like was in my inner circle in some ways. And she's like, Megan, don't you think we've already thought about all that and done that already? And if it had worked, we would have done it. And it was so deflating for me to have that response, because I felt kind of embarrassed. I felt kind of foolish. I also felt like, well, what's the point of me showing up with my ideas if that's what's going on? So I wonder, from your perspective, both in doing your podcast and in your experience as a school administrator and in education for so long, do you think there's a difference between being in the trenches and being burned out? And how do you differentiate between those?
Well, from the guests that I've had, there are a lot of people who would not say that trench moment is necessarily something negative. There are some people that say, I'm working with kids, I'm working with families, I'm in the trenches, but that's something they're passionate about. So I have talked to people who were burnt out, who are now supporting educators who were burnt out, and more so now, obviously, this past school year. But I think from my experience, looking back and as a newer teacher, I think a lot of newer teachers lack the support that they need, right? There are some schools that have that mentor program going, or, it's more, I would say it's more an official mentor program than something that's actually really practiced, because it can be on paper and the person can, get that stipend or whatnot. But you're making that transition, right, from your student teaching to the first school you're at, and it's kind of, you're throwing in the fire, I would say. I mean, my own story is, I had done my student teaching at IB schools, right, and so they were like the magnet schools in the area, And then I finished that at the end, like at the end of a semester. When I'd gotten my teaching degree done, I just subbed for a semester. And then I decided to go to Canada for 2 years, and I tried to pursue a doctorate, and I didn't complete that one, but I completed one years later. But so those 2 years I was in Canada, I was teaching adults. So, I was outside of the K-12 classroom. So when I got my first teaching job with high schoolers, I'd kind of forgotten some of those skills and how to interact with high schoolers and what to expect from, that classroom management perspective. And I don't think my student teaching really prepared me to deal with some of the classroom management issues I had my first year or so of teaching, because
they rarely do. I mean,
yeah, of course. And then you're thrown into, like, I recently just moved to Colorado, and I was thrown into an area I wasn't familiar with the culture of the area, right? And that's so, like, for me, I would say my trenches as a new teacher, it was being like unfamiliar with the culture of the area. I was very passionate about my subject area, very knowledgeable about my subject area, and I had a lot of great ideas for activities. But it was building those relationships with kids and, communicating clearly my expectations, and actually, that classroom management piece, I think, lacks when you're not really, I guess, teaching in the same school you did your student teaching in, right? So it helps when you're kind of transitioning into that same school or the same district. So, that, I think that's kind of what I would say burns off a lot of teachers, right? Is that they're in either their first 3 to 5 years, they're in a school that, they feel like nothing's getting done, and they're not being supported, or they feel like, they're not getting recognized for anything that they have done. After I'd been teaching a few years and was a department chair, I got on a few committees, but I know a lot of the time, some people have big ideas and they're not always recognized. So I think that could be, and it could just be the change of place that helps some educators, right? There are a lot of educators that say, I'm just going to quit teaching, I'm going to do something else. But maybe they've been at the same school for their whole career, right? So it could just be changing. But there's so much available to newer educators now. And I think, those type of platforms can help a lot of educators just get their questions answered, because people are so unsure, right? Of, oh, well, I got this email from this parent, right? What should I do, right?
Right. No, I mean, I think you're naming a lot of really great points. And I think what I'm hearing is, and maybe Susan and I are making the leap that the trenches, we were likening it to warfare, I think, and kind of so Susan went to resilience. I went to like burnout, which probably gives us a clue about our personalities right there. And I think what you're referencing more is around, like, right, there's a lot of support that's needed for educators. And being in schools at all, you're in the trenches. I often say the same thing. I mean, I guess my framing is often we're on the front lines. And I share that to name that when you're an educator, you're on. You don't get to pick and choose your kids. You don't get to pick and choose your schools often. And you have to kind of adapt in the moment. And so that's exciting to hear that you've been gathering stories of people who are doing that are responding to the moment. And when those challenges hit, they're finding a way through them, which is really cool. Yeah.
Well, we are up on our first break.
Are you ready to change the way we do school? Yeah, me too. This is Megan Sweet from The Awakening Educator, and I've designed programming that empowers educators to reimagine how they approach their work. The pandemic has laid bare what most of us already knew. Our schools are under-resourced. Our system is set up to fail our most vulnerable students. Our educators are burned out and overwhelmed, and we all deserve better. With almost 30 years in education and 15 dedicated to leading school reform, I have been there and I get it. I've sat in the same seats that many of you have. I've been a classroom teacher and a school administrator. I've led district, county, and statewide reforms. I've coached dozens of teachers, principals, and executive leaders, and I've partnered with students, parents, and community activists. I have the scars from a lifetime of scrapping out in education, but also the lived experience that change is possible. After facing the prospect of quitting education myself, I began a journey to understand how I could stay in the profession I love, but do it in a way that was sustainable. Here's what I now know. It begins with self-care. Prioritizing ourselves can feel counterintuitive for educators, but when we give without attending to our own needs, eventually we run out of resources and burnout ensues. But when we stop fighting the system and instead look inward for the answers we seek, we live more empowered lives and are better able to create the educational settings where our students will thrive. Here's what I also know. We already have the answers inside of us, we just sometimes need help getting them out. And that's where I come in. I love supporting educators to find their inner voice and match all those school smarts with their innate instincts about what works best for students. My superpowers are listening well, synthesizing ideas, and breaking complex processes into understandable and accessible parts. How will we do it? It all starts with doing what I call self-work, dedicating time and attention to building a relationship with ourselves. We do this in a course I call the Beliefs Lab. By the end of this course, you'll understand why self-care is essential for being an effective educator, and you'll have strategies you can use right now. You will also get a handle on some of those beliefs that are helping you and those that are getting in the way. The next step is doing the schoolwork, leading classroom and school change. In the course I call The Cycle, you will learn a process for realizing goals for yourself and for your educational context simultaneously. You will also have deeper insights and strategies for putting your plans into action. Want more support as you engage in this self-work and schoolwork? I've got you covered. My personalized coaching and consulting services are designed to meet you in your school right where you are and support you to clarify your vision for the future. Want to know even more about what I do? My book is a great place to start. An Educator's Guide for Using Your 3 Eyes details the self-work and schoolwork that I described above and talks about concrete ways that you can start to feel better right now. If you want to learn more about how to work with me in the courses I just described, please come to my website, www.your3eyes.com. That's YOUR, the number 3, EYES.com. I can't wait to support you to realize a better future for yourself and for your school community.
Welcome back. And we've moved around. We've shifted around the screen. So before
musical
we went,
chairs.
I know, musical chairs. The Awakening Educator has moved to this new platform called StreamYard. And so we're learning and checking things out. So that we can hope to have more engagement from our audience. And so we really encourage you to comment wherever you're watching us, if you're on YouTube or Facebook or in our Facebook group. When you comment, we can share that across our platform. So we're super excited to be bringing our community closer together in conversation. And today is such an important conversation because I think, as Megan was saying before we went out, thinking about the trenches from both the end of the resiliency building aspect of it, as well as the potential for burnout. And I'll often talk about the ethical responsibility for self-care and the need for self-care. And I'm curious about how this year in particular, when we think about the trenches and how many of us really experienced like kind of an overwhelming shift in learning and growing. And I mean, many teachers who have been teaching for 20, 30 years had to completely change their practice, and sort of all of a sudden where you feel really confident and really confident in your practice and your instructional skills, none of those translated into the new environment. And then you might have young, newer teachers who are really tech savvy, who are much more comfortable with things. So it sort of kind of had a playing field that was swapped or different. And I'm wondering if part of your process in opening up the podcast this year was, why is it important for us to share these stories of both the resiliency aspect to it and the burnout potential? Like, why do we want to share these stories? Why is it really important for us to share across?
Well, as I mentioned a while ago, it's learning from those other people, right? Because nobody's perfect. I could have a guest on who's written up to 50 books. I mean, I had Todd Whitaker on, right? And he had difficulties when he started out as a teacher, right? He had a student that kept falling asleep in class. I mean, I think it really helps the educators who are listening to realize, whether or not somebody's been in education for 30 years or, they're newer in education, and we can all see that somebody's been through difficult times, right? And like during the pandemic and when everything went remote, everybody was in the same boat, right? But it was more difficult for some than others. And I think we all have that community. I know in the spring a year ago, not everybody necessarily had as much communication from their school as other schools did. But for me myself, I just jumped on PD. There was a lot of PD available through Corwin, and I just encourage people who this summer they might want to unwind from their obviously from their curriculum and not think about what they're doing the next year. I would highly encourage teachers to just try to take a break from their school. But if there is something that they're passionate about in terms of learning more, like more about trauma-informed practices or more about just self-care for educators, those type of things, there are a lot of conferences going on this summer. There are a few statewide in-person conferences, at least here in Colorado, that are taking place later in the summer, but there's a lot of virtual conferences also. So I think when you're able to connect with other educators through these conference events and find out what they're doing, it also kind of helps to bring those people out of the trenches. So I think it's an ebb and flow, right, of our career. I know a couple educators who have decided, they just weren't going to continue after this year. A friend of mine who's probably a couple years out from retirement decided to retire, but not necessarily due to everything being in and out of remote, but it was also just kind of the shift in how they were teaching. She's a Spanish teacher. So a shift of how they were teaching Spanish and the curriculum and the type of instructional methods they were using at her school no longer were the type that she taught from. So, that's a reason sometimes people also decide to either take early retirement or just find somewhere else to work. That friend of mine, for example, she'd been teaching at the same school, I think since 92 or 93. So 28, 29 years. And she's just like, okay, I'm going to retire a couple of years early, but she's been in there and she's done the work in the trenches for all these years. So, those type of educators should be applauded.
Yeah, I think I appreciate what for sure, we need to applaud educators that have been in the classroom for 28 years. I lasted 10 years. That was the length of what I was able to pull off before I decided to move into administration. Because I started feeling myself getting, I don't know if burnt out was a word, wiggly is the word I tend to use, where I knew that a full career in the classroom wasn't for me. What I really appreciate about what you just named, and actually we have a question from someone on Facebook about resources for support and self-care. I think telling our stories is a part of that self-care and of knowing and owning our stories. And there is actually a good body of research that says that that educators, especially new educators, learn a lot from experienced educators. So something that I'm really appreciating about what you're sharing is you're just kind of demystifying the fact that it's hard to be a teacher. It's hard to be a teacher when you're a first-year teacher. It's hard to be a teacher when you're in year 28. And when we keep those stories to ourselves and we don't tell everybody that we're struggling or that things are hard, then often we feel alone. And, that's the gift and the challenge of being in the classroom is that you get to close that door, right? Yeah. So you close that door and no one bugs you. That's the gift, generally speaking. Like you get to do your thing in your classroom and create really magical experiences with your kids. The challenge of that is that you close your door. And learning how to open your door and sharing practices or sharing the vulnerabilities of, I don't know what I'm doing, this is hard, I think is a really big challenge for educators. I do think this year forced educators to come out of that. And I love your point, Susan, about, kind of the tables were switched, right? So the experienced teachers who have their routines down this year became the learners, whereas the younger teachers had something to offer, which is they're conversant on multimedia platforms. They probably already had a lot of technology embedded into their instruction because they're probably taught that way. And they're more oriented that way because they grew up with technology at their fingertips. And the three of us, and most of us that are our age or, I'd put it at like 40 and above, that wasn't our experience. That wasn't how we were trained. I was trained in my school, in my teaching education program. And I will say I am 28 years in, I'll be 28 years in this fall, which is frightening to say. But I was trained to teach the most advanced audiovisual media at the time was a slide projector. And an overhead projector with like the markers, but literally I was taught how to teach history with a slide projector where kids stand into, you put them in like into a history scene. The slides, literal like slides. So that's
I've
my
used those
training
too when I taught French.
Yeah, so that's we're oriented, and these kids are like moving in and around media. So I do think there's this neat opportunity for sharing practices and expertise, and but maybe to answer my answer was one of the SEL or self-care things is to know your story and own it and take the risk of sharing it with someone else. Maybe as our kind of wrapping up conversation, maybe we can continue to answer this question, or Dana, have you heard anything from any of your own wisdom or from the people you've interviewed around this self-care question?
Well, a couple of the people I've interviewed, I'll go ahead and give those names. Amber Harper is Burned In Educator. So she's burned in teacher. And also we have Happy Teacher Revolution. There's Dana Thomas, so it's Happy Teacher Rev on Twitter. So both of them work with, they've left the classroom, but they're working with educators in discovering more self-care. They have some type of teacher masterminds. They have resources online. I did put some links in the, and also a lot of educators don't know that the Calm app is free if you're an educator. So, you get all their resources on there. And, I think doing a daily meditation for 10 minutes helps a lot to start out the day, but fresh air always helps as well. So,
I think that's a great point that, you can really demystify. I think self-care becomes this really hard thing. I often say that, people are like, self-care has to be, I need to go and get a manicure or pedicure, and that's cool. Or I need to do something else, but really it's actually choosing to actively take care of yourself in any way. And I love your examples because they're very simple, easy, actionable ones, which is right at lunch, walk around the track. Kids aren't there at lunch because everyone's at lunch. You get to exercise a little bit instead of sitting in your classroom grading papers. Go out. I talk about the same thing, like, at home, spend 5 extra minutes in the bathroom just to get some private and alone space. If that's the only place you can do it, cool. Like, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, I think you're bringing up an important point, Megan, too, is it's really individual. And so what's going to feel self-care to me is not going to feel self-care to somebody else. That might feel off, like getting up at 5:30 and working out might feel awful to one person, but for the other, that they need it to. That was pre-pandemic for me, getting up at 5:30. That's not post-pandemic. I think I need to refine that one.
Doesn't get up at 5:30 in the morning.
No, not anymore. I got to figure out how to get that early again. But I also am thinking back to some of the shows that we had. We talked with Jacqueline around teacher burnout, and Kelly Knoke from the Teaching Well to talk about mindfulness as a practice for self-care for educators. And then our most recent show, really thinking specifically about BIPOC and Black leaders and their self-care practice. Right. So I think it's important for us to bring it to the discourse and bring it to the conversation and have it be part of the culture, and then really recognize the individual and the individual stressors and circumstances that person is in, and make sure that you have a self-care plan and lens that works for who you are and the way in which you experience education.
Yeah, that's really true. Dana, this was really great to talk with you today. It was so nice to have you on the show. And can you tell everybody how to find you, how to find your podcast, and ways that they can connect with you?
Well, the podcast can be downloaded anywhere you download podcasts. It's Out of the Trenches, and there is a Twitter for the Out of the Trenches, just Out of Trenches PC. I also have that handle on Instagram, and my personal Twitter is at Dana Goodyear, and my website is danagoodyear.com.
Wonderful.
And so Dana, you're welcome to hang out with us. We're introducing our new next our spot, which we've added to our podcast, which is Educator Spotlight. We like to educate somebody in the field who's doing something amazing. And so if you would like, you're welcome to hang out. I'm going to send you into the back room while we do this. I'm looking for the language. So The waiting room, I believe it's called. So give me a second.
The waiting room.
The waiting room.
Susan, who'd you pick today?
So we have here. Let me see. I gotta find my slide deck here. So I'm super excited. I can't talk and
Okay, I'm not talking
think
to you.
at the same
Right,
time
do it.
because that's too much multitasking. And I hope, yep, there we go. Present. All right. So Maggie Vasquez is a Chicago Charter School Academy of Global Citizenship, 4th grade teacher, and they had a chance to observe animals and plants close up during her school's 2-night camping trip. And thanks to the school's founder, Helma Wandernar refused to let Vasquez's cerebral palsy stop her from going on the school's annual trip, even though it meant carrying the 10-year-old on her back for 3 days of hiking.
Oh, that gave me shivers. Such an example of educators and what they're willing to do for their kids.
I love this story because I think even though this is one educators carry so much on their back, and just that I also like she was like playful and was like, someone forgot to. She was just a human element to this story, and it just shows me the fierceness of educators who are like, no, this student gets to participate. And I think so many folks would say, nope, this is we're all going camping, but unfortunately she can't come, and the creativity to make it work.
Yeah, inclusion is so important, and often I feel like kids do get left behind. We plan those trips, and certain kids just aren't even thought about. So I love the advocacy that the teacher had just to make sure that all of her kids got to go, and then to literally carry her student on her back does not surprise me at all. It feels like just what educators do. That's what we do. That's who we are. We show up in that way, and yeah, what a great story.
Kind of reminds me of how, you have those stories of those teams, and how, coaches that are often teachers as well, go the extra mile to see their students succeed. So, we find those stories everywhere where, they're staying late, they're helping students, they're, students who otherwise might be marginalized, they're giving them those opportunities for future success.
That's great.
Great. Well, thank you, Dana. It was such a joy to have you here and have this conversation. I think sometimes taking a moment to pause and think about all of the ways that maybe we struggled as educators with the lens of resiliency, with the lens of how do we take these stories to make us better, is such an important piece. So we're really grateful that you engaged in this conversation with us today. Again, if you like what you've heard, please check us out on Spreaker, on YouTube, on iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcasts. Subscribe, rate us, whether you like us or not. It really helps. The more folks are engaged with us, the better it keeps us going and keeps us moving in terms of really trying to bring excellent content to you.
Yeah. Thanks, Dana, for joining us today. It was really nice to have you.
Thanks so much for having me on.